Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 114, Global Moral Issues. This is the issue overview for Unit 4, where we talk about environmental ethics. Along the way, we also talk a little bit of animal ethics stuff. Overall, it's a shorter unit. We don't go into as many different discussions as we normally do, because we got to squeeze the midterm on end of this thing. But we do get to tackle a couple of different very central questions that are also very timely if we look at the news and just the state of the world these days. So, for this lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to look at our central question, that of moral status, and then take a glance at the two different sides to this question that we're going to look at. Not opposing sides, but different topic areas that we'll focus on with each of these. First, the moral status of animals, and then actually looking at the moral status of the land and the environment. And we'll sort of just get a overview and a glimpse of the stuff we're looking at ahead before looking at specific lectures for either of those two topics. So, to start us off, just generally thinking about things. When we do ethics, when we do morals, that is, when we live through moral choices and work with moral experiences, usually the kinds of things we think of are people, or at the very least, we think about things that we have relationships to in certain ways. We might expand our areas of concern besides just family and friends, but also to pets. We might worry about our house or the place where we grew up or maybe our hometown. But morality extends to more than just these, or at least a lot of us think so. Oftentimes we think of the environment, we think about the natural world in moral terms. We think about people doing something morally wrong when they dump pollution into a river. Or we might wonder about what sort of obligations or rights do we have to animals? What sort of rights do animals have? What kind of obligations do we have to them? And these sorts of questions are not just odd little facets of what the moral experience is really like. These things are pressing issues that we have to deal with. No matter where you fall in the political spectrum or what sort of beliefs you have about this sort of thing, it's hard to deny that climate change and global warming exist, whether we like it or not. And it's affecting the way that we deal with other people. It's going to affect the future of our civilization and of our species, not to mention the future of all the other species on the planet. The planet will survive, of course. It's a question of will it survive in any recognizable fashion, and will it survive without causing massive amounts of suffering or involving massive amounts of suffering? And these are important moral questions that we have to deal with. Additionally, there's just more general questions, even if we ignore the hot button sides of this sort of topic, of pain and suffering and living creatures that exist besides human beings. If animals do have rights, well, animals die every day, often at human hands, and in some instances, largely by human hands. If they in fact have moral rights and they're being violated, that means that injustice is being committed in some sense every single day. So, environmental questions and questions about animal ethics and all that sort of thing are not questions that we can put off. They're things that are very dramatically going to affect us. And I don't want to preach on any particular topic because, again, remember, I am officially neutral on every subject that comes up in this class. I have no official beliefs on what any of these topics mean or what the right answer in any of these problems are. But I think that the problems that surround this sort of thing are not ones that we can ignore. There's either injustice that we need to correct or be able to be comfortable with if it's not injustice right this very moment. And there are questions and issues and things surrounding the environment and climate change that are very pressing, things that are urgent and that will affect all of us, whether we like it or not. So they are questions that we have to consider. But in considering these sorts of things and wondering about the environment, about animals, about all of these sorts of things, things that are loosely wrapped up in the question of or the topic of environmental ethics, the fundamental question, the thing that we're going to focus on, is the question of moral status. That is, the question of who or what is worthy of moral consideration, which is not to say that we're going to be talking about which things are important or which things matter more. Instead, it's a question of which sort of things should play a central role in our moral thinking. What sort of things do we have obligations to? Which sort of things can have rights? What sort of things can place constraints on our activity and all the stuff that we do as people? This is the fundamental question that I want to tackle for our Global Moral Issues course. Overall, this isn't a course, if you remember, it tells you what to think on a given topic. It highlights some of the main questions and problems and things that surround a topic or a given subject. And in this case, I think the question of moral status really gets at the heart of environmental ethics in a lot of ways. So, our main focus then is a question of which sort of things, who or what, actually has moral status. Which things are worthy of, intense moral consideration when we try and decide what the right thing to do is. Now, when we talk about moral status, it's worth noting a couple of things. As I said a moment ago, it's not the same as what matters. So, if we were to say, for example, that animals have no moral status, that does not mean that animals are not important, or that animals are not valuable, or animals are not good, or anything like that. Instead, it's simply saying that they shouldn't have the same sort of place in our moral thinking that we might give to, say, fellow human beings. Now, similarly, a moral status is something that can come in degrees. So when we ask about what sort of things have moral status, it's not enough to simply say, oh, well, X, Y, and Z get moral status. Instead, this is something that comes in degrees. And it's the sort of thing where the explanation and the criteria for it matters quite a lot. If we base moral status simply on being a member of a certain species, like do you have Homo sapiens sapiens DNA inside of you? Well, then that's going to have different implications than if the criterion for moral status is, well, can you think rationally? Or if you can suffer, if we want to follow Peter Singer's angle on this sort of thing. And with those criterion, we can then ask, how much moral consideration should you be given? How large of a place in our moral thinking should you get? If animals have moral status, do they have equal moral status to a human being? Or do they have something different? Can a tree have moral status? Can an ecosystem? Can the planet? These are the kinds of questions that environmental ethics are built around. And it's this kind of topic that really gets at the heart of things. Now, before we move forward with the rest of this, it's worth noting that moral status comes into a couple of different flavors. There are two different sorts of moral consideration that we can have towards different things. And this distinction is an important one to have because, again, the explanation for moral status matters quite a lot when we actually determine what the right thing to do in a given situation is. So, there's both direct and indirect moral consideration. And we ought to be able to keep these straight and sometimes distinguish between the two. Direct moral consideration, or when we say that something is worthy of direct moral consideration, that we're saying that it's worthy of moral concern for its own sake. That is, it has and deserves a place in our moral thinking because of the kind of thing that it is. And this is the way that we usually think about people. Like, we don't think that people only should be involved in our moral thinking and moral decision making processes because of what they can do for us, because of how they relate to us as people or individuals. We don't just look at what they can do for us as selfish, self-interested people. Usually, we like to think of human beings as being things that ought to be valued for their own sake, for the kind of thing that they are, regardless of what they can do for us. On the opposite end, though, is the notion of indirect moral consideration, where we talk about something being worthy of moral concern for the sake of that thing's relationship to something else. And this is the way that some people Where some theorists, I don't want to just say some people, the way that some theorists imagine that animals might have moral status. They might be worthy of indirect moral consideration, where we don't look at animals as necessarily having moral status in their own right. They do, they have a place in our moral thinking, but because of their relationship, say, to us, because, say, your pet bunny rabbit is something that very much that matters to you, well, then it should have a place in your moral thinking. It's not because the bunny rabbit itself is worthy of moral consideration, but it's because of its relationship to you that it should have moral consideration. And that kind of distinction changes what kind of duties and obligations we might have to things. So when we talk about moral consideration, when we talk about moral status, we'll sometimes be talking about direct moral consideration, we'll sometimes be talking about indirect. And it's worth making a note of which one's which and making sure that we can be clear about which sort are we talking about in a given context. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can phrase the questions that we want to look at. And in fact, there are a couple of different versions of those questions. And along with those come the general layout of options and positions that we can talk about. One of the first questions about moral status we have to ask is who has moral status? Or what sort of creatures or things can have moral status? And additionally, as part of that, what sort of status are we talking about? Are we talking about direct or indirect moral consideration? What explanation or basis is there for that thing's moral status? Now, the general options here are the three positions known as anthropocentrism, zoocentrism, and biocentrism. Now, probably the most intuitive response for a lot of people is what's called anthropocentrism, literally from the Greek term anthropos, meaning human, and centered or being focused on. So, anthropocentrism is being centered or focused on human beings. It's the idea or position that only human beings have moral standing or moral status. And for a lot of people, this is just the default way that they think. Human beings are the only ones that we really ought to worry about when we're trying to figure out moral questions. Other views are what we can call zoocentrism, that is animal centrism, and biocentrism, life centrism. Zoocentrism says that animals, both human animals and non human animals, have moral status. I say human animals because biologically we are. We are not fungi, we are not plants, we're not minerals, we're animals of a certain sense. So zoocentrism takes anthropocentrism and expands it a little bit further. It includes non human animals within that realm of things that have moral status, things that deserve moral consideration. Biocentrism does the same sort of thing, but expands the circle even further. It says that all living things have some degree or another of moral status. Now, these positions don't automatically say that they all have equal moral status. If you're a zoocentrist, that doesn't automatically mean that a mouse deserves the same sort of moral consideration as a human being. But it does mean that they do deserve some, that they have a significant place in our moral thinking of one way or some sense or another. And sometimes the distinctions between these sorts of things or the explanations has to do with sentience, which is a vocab term, just means awareness or consciousness. A thing is sentient if it is aware of its surroundings and it can feel and experience and so on. Biocentrism, for example, often does not worry about sentience as a criterion for having moral status, whereas zoocentrism might. And I only bring it up so that we can be clear about the vocabulary. But all three of these positions, anthropocentrism, zoocentrism, biocentrism, they map out the main options for what sort of things have moral status in our thinking. They're not the only possible categories, and they're not individual theories. They're more like, as with most of our terms, umbrella terms that envelop a variety of different positions. But they're worth at least knowing about and being able to distinguish between them. It's also worth noting that biocentrism and to a certain extent zoocentrism, these two positions come in a couple of different flavors, what we might call species egalitarian flavors and non egalitarian flavors. And these mean about what it sounds like on the label. Species egalitarians say that different species deserve equal moral consideration, whereas non egalitarians don't. And we'll talk more in detail about all of these different positions as we move forwards. Now, if we start talking about moral status in animals and that sort of thing, probably several of you are thinking about animal rights at this point. And that's not a wrong direction to take this sort of thing. Issues of animal rights, or the idea that animals have moral status that can't easily be overridden, that they have significant moral status. This is the sort of issue that we are exactly talking about. It's slightly distinct from the question of general moral status. Some people use the term animal rights to simply discuss or refer to the question of whether or not animals have moral status at all. We'll generally use it to mean something a little bit stronger, meaning that animals have moral status that cannot easily be overridden. And as part of this whole discussion, we can't really avoid the term speciesism either, which is simply the notion of discrimination based on species rather than race, as in racism, or class, as in classism, and so on. These things are just part and parcel of the subject matter, and they're things that we'll talk about in the next lecture in more detail. So, to illustrate some of what we're talking about with this sort of issue, and why this sort of thing is worth talking about, not just what the question is, but why it's an important sort of thing to talk about. The picture I have in front of you is an image of one of the oldest trees on Earth. It is over 5,000 years old, and it's located in the western United States, in California, if I remember. Now, this tree seems to be something rather significant. If it were to be destroyed or bulldozed, or if someone were to, say, take a can of lighter fluid and a match to it, we'd probably all consider it pretty horrible that the tree was destroyed. In fact, if it was deliberately destroyed, we might react with shock and horror at the one who did it. But we have the question, did they do something morally wrong when they destroyed the tree? If we assume that it belongs to nobody and nobody got hurt as far as like humans go, we might wonder whether anything morally wrong was done by torching the world's oldest tree or something like that. That question relies on the question of whether or not the tree has moral status. We might ask, does the tree have a significant place in our moral thinking? Is it worthy of moral consideration? Is it the kind of thing that can have that status? This is the kind of question that relies on us talking about the issues that we're going to. So it's something that is not necessarily easy to answer on its own. And it's not something that's just for the vegans or the health nuts or whatever else, because we face all sorts of decisions like this. The world's oldest tree is one special thing, but what about the forests of Indiana? If we want to talk about the Hoosier National Forest, or if we simply want to talk about a particular field right outside of Lafayette or something like that, if we want to talk about clear cutting for commercial development, if we want to talk about pollution and climate change and whatever else, if we want to work through these sorts of problems, and if we want to live in a way that has to do with other things on the planet, which virtually everything we do does, we need to be able to think clearly about the moral sides to all of these actions. And while we don't necessarily need to all become tree-hugging hippies in the process, I'm not trying to, again, preach any particular sort of message. Considering the problem and having answers to the question is very much an important thing. Now, a separate sort of question, still related to the issue of moral status, but phrased in a different way and approaching a different set of problems, is the question of how we should be doing all of the moral considering. That is, at what level should we be doing moral consideration? That is, should we be thinking about individual of organisms and entities and so on, or should we be looking at structures and systems and that sort of thing? Does an individual tree have moral status? Does a forest? Does a field? Does an ecosystem? Which sorts of things can have moral status? This is the sort of thing that comes up as a structural question, almost a methodological question. It's like if we were trying to design some kind of a ratings app or something like that. Something like Yelp or Foursquare or something in those neighborhoods. If we were to try and build some kind of a ratings or an evaluation app, at some point as developers, we would have to decide what kinds of things can people rate. Do we want them to rate restaurants? Do we want them to rate whole cities or a neighborhood? Maybe we want to have people, share their opinions on various types or cuisines of food or that sort of thing. Some of the options are more ridiculous than others, but only because of the kind of thing that we're talking about. An app where people rate Mexican food as 4 out of 5 stars, but Chinese food gets 5 out of 5 or something like that. That seems a little bit ridiculous and useless because of the kind of question that it is. But knowing that means that we can avoid certain kinds of answers and we can, build a better app overall. We know which sorts of mistakes to avoid. It's not only so easy to tell which sort of scale and which sort of topics should we be evaluating when we deal with environmental ethics. So questions of what sorts of things can have moral status, be it individual things or systems or networks of things, is also a very valuable question to look at. And here we can label our different options and positions as ecological individualism and ecological holism. Now, the three sorts of centrisms, anthropocentrism, zoocentrism, biocentrism, I mentioned just a few minutes ago, these are all forms of individualism of one way or another. They all treat individual beings and organisms as the basic unit of concern. So they talk about individual plants and animals and people and so on. The alternative is to be a holist about moral status, to be an ecological holist. And this is the sort of position that says that the whole biosphere or an entire ecosystem or an environment, a system of some sort, is the sort of thing that holds status, is the sort of thing that deserves moral consideration. And while that may seem like a small point, it's one that very much matters. If we're looking at, say, a system of organisms as being the thing that has moral status, as the thing that's worthy of moral concern, and that changes which sorts of actions might be permissible versus not permissible. Because if a system of things is permissible, if a system of things is what holds moral status, then the good of the whole may be far more important than the good of any individual creature. So, being clear about what sort of things can hold moral status, having an answer to this question as well, can very much influence our moral thinking and is very much an important topic for us to tackle. And additionally, if we're looking at questions of holism and so on, it might be possible for the land itself or for an entire landscape or location to have moral status. And we might start talking about the moral status of a national park or of the Great Plains or of the oceans, whereas previously we had limited our moral thoughts and concerns to just living things, to individuals, things that are difficult to use to describe an ocean in any sense. So our answers to these matter when we try and answer moral questions, when we try and tackle these moral problems. And accordingly, the way that we've laid this out, over the next couple of lectures, we'll approach this unit in two different parts. We'll first look at the moral status of animals as a separate sort of question from the moral status of the land or the environment. And so for each of these topics, rather than having separate for and against lectures, we'll sort of tackle both sides of the topic within the same lecture. We'll look at some for and against and a variety of perspectives. But instead, we'll have the lectures organized around a question. We'll have one lecture on, well, exactly the moral status of animals and what sorts of things, who should have moral status. And then the second will be at what scale should we be thinking of moral status? What kinds of things, broadly speaking, categorically speaking, should have moral status? So if you haven't already, start taking a look at the readings, take a look at the details of all stuff. Don't forget to keep an eye on the midterm and your due dates. And I will see you in the next one.